Well, welcome everybody. My name is Matthew Rowe. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Wool Council and the Campaign for Wool here in Canada. Thank you for joining us once again for our Spinning Yarn speaker series. This speaker series was requested by you to provide an opportunity to learn more about the work of the Campaign for Wool here in Canada, as well as to hear from the amazing Canadians from coast to coast to coast who are doing amazing things with Canadian wool. Today we've got a very special guest. Jane Underhill has been involved with the campaign for several years now and is our go-to in terms of research when it comes to tackling the really big issues that affect the Canadian wool industry. She was the co-author of our Wool Plan, which is the strategic plan that guides all of our work here in Canada. For those of you who haven't read it yet, again, as I always say, it makes good bedtime reading. But it's jam-packed with excellent research and information. And if you're ever wondering about where we're going with the campaign and the Canadian Wool Council, literally that's the blueprint. And of course, the goals of that plan are to rebrand and revalue Canadian wool, to connect the entire Canadian wool value chain, and to connect Canadian wool to the world. So Jane has actually been involved in many research projects that do a lot of that. She's here speaking about her latest project. And as I've been warned that I do take her best talking points, I don't want to get into it. I'm going to leave her to get into the specifics. But as always, we're going to have a short presentation by Jane, and then we're going to get into open questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to put it over to Jane to talk about the shearing plan, which again was shearing and infrastructure. The shearing infrastructure was identified in our wool plan, and Jane's going to talk about her work to see about how we can improve the state of shearing and access to shearing here in Canada. So over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Matthew. I think I know most of you on the call. Most of you are quite familiar with me and some of the work that I do. I will say that Matthew is as knowledgeable about the wool industry as I am, but I just have a particular passion for doing strategy pieces that might help bring the value of wool up for producers and help improve the industry across Canada. So thanks everyone for coming today. Comme d'habitude avec mes présentations, soyez à l'aise de poser vos questions en français ou en anglais. Please feel free to ask your questions in English or French, and I'm happy to translate and answer in both languages. We have I have a PowerPoint presentation that kind of gives some key points I'd like to make, but really, I'll be honest, I didn't prepare any type of script. The shearing plan is a big piece of the puzzle in any wool industry, not just in Canada, in any wool industry. It's an ancient craft that has been brought into modern times, and how we position it in the wool world is a complex one, and it means a lot to different people along the value chain. So when I started the shearing plan, I tried to look at it from all the people who are affected by it. That sometimes means that I looked at it through the eyes of the producer. I looked at it through the eyes of the supply chain. I looked at it through the eyes of the consumer, and I looked at it through the eyes of the shearer. And I still believe that was the right approach to take. So beyond giving that little synopsis, let's dive into my talking points. Feel free to, raise your hand and ask questions. If you want to put questions in the chat, do so, and we'll look at them at the end. But I'll count on you to guide the discussion, and you tell me what's interesting for you in the plan, and I'm happy to address those. But Alyssa, can you put up our PowerPoint, our very general PowerPoint? All right, terrific. So if I'm not mistaken, are those Carol Precious's sheep? They've become the mascot. Okay, why a national shearing plan? We're gonna summarize with that at the end. Why this is an important consideration. Alyssa, can you jump into the next slide, please? Next slide.
That's Don Metherall's hand.
That's Don. I wish Don could be here today. He was a big part of our work. So I wanted to give a few acknowledgements. This plan, I might have been the one to draft it and go down the rabbit holes, but it's really a plan that was brought together by the shearers. We started with kind of a general framework, and then we formed what I call the advisory circle. And I want to name them because they are formidable people in their own right. They have great talents in shearing. They come from legacy families in shearing. So from east to west, we'll start with Sarah Nettleton, who is out in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and her sister Fiona Breckenridge. Fiona is actually a New Zealand, well, she's a New Zealander now, but started her career shearing under her father in Nova Scotia. Amber Peterson out of Prince Edward Island, the legend Don Metherall, Ruko Brat, also a shearer in Ontario, Jenny Carnigan, who played a role as our producer advisor, Russell Eddy, who is a shearer and comes from a shearing family on the prairies in Manitoba, Graham Ranney, also out west, shearer, but really an expert in wool handling, has a lot of experience in wool handling and the subtleties of wool. Lisa, of course, who's with us today. Lisa's originally from Alberta, but based out of the US. And I would say she is our all-around expert when it comes to wool, sheep production, the whole ovine industry in North America. She's been our go-to person and has worked with us at the Campaign for Wool Canada for a long time now in giving us expert guidance. Alex Baker, Alberta, a shearer, but also an expert in animal nutrition, sheep management, and if I'm not mistaken, a lot of land management practices as well. So he has been very helpful on our shearing advisory. And last but not least is Peter Demoy, who's based in BC on Vancouver Island. And he has a long career in shearing and in training the next generation of shearers. So I was really honored to work with them. They have a very keen understanding of their industry, and they were really able to help us craft a nice plan. Also, thanks go out to our international community, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, United States, and Finland. They have all contributed information, insights, data, stories on what's worked in their wool industry. And the Shearing Canada Facebook page, a closed group of 260 shearers who mostly are based in Canada. Some are based outside of Canada, but either teach or shear in Canada. And working with them, exchanging with them has brought probably the biggest insights into crafting the plan. So my thanks go out to all of those folks. There wouldn't be a plan without them. It's really their vision that was put into this story. Can we jump to the next slide, please, Alyssa? What sparked this report? Matthew touched on it already. It was the wool plan. The wool plan identified 5 roadblocks to a revitalized wool industry. What I've noticed in my research since doing the wool plan is those 5 obstacles do not belong only in Canada. They are what every wool nation faces. We have supply chain disruption that's happening from the pandemic. We have war that's going on that has changed the way wool is processed and moved. The 5 obstacles that we saw belong to the world. But for what relates to Canada, one of the things was education. In the wool plan, we titled that as simply education, but what's more important is it's not just shearer education or not just producer education that I've come to realize. It's not just wool handling education. It's the whole wool industry that needs to come together and decide on their education plan in a way that's harmonious and in sync with the needs of the other. We can't have the shearers investing in their education without investing in producer education. We can't invest in producer education without investing in education for our supply chain, for our wool transformers, our spinners, weavers, dyers, all that. Everybody needs to be taking education seriously in Canada, and it has to be done in such a way that we're all working toward the same end goals. May I ask you to go to the next slide, Alyssa? I just wanted to touch briefly on our approach for the shearing plan. We started by soliciting information from the international community. I must say that our work with the IWTO has brought us a wealth of knowledge and connections, and I'm continuously amazed at how generous the global community is to reach out. The global community has kind of fallen in love with the Canadian wool story, and they have more confidence in us than I think we have in ourselves. We have a really nice quality of wool in Canada. We have a nice size of industry. Yes, we're in a huge country. Yes, that comes with its own challenges, but overall, we have a lot of reasons to be really positive about what's going on here. So it's our international group that we solicited advice from. We formed our advisory circle. That was a group that formed organically. We reached out to the few shearers who we felt comfortable, like who we knew very well, to open the conversation with. And from there, we asked them who are the most experienced, the most knowledgeable shearers in Canada, and can we bring them all together to represent the industry? So that's quite simply how the shearing advisory was formed. We did a lot of social media engagement. So not only the Shearing Canada Facebook page, but I engaged with shearing industries online around the world, Falkland Islands shearing, Finland, the British shearing organizations. We also talked with the value chain stakeholders across Canada and globally to see how they interact with their wool industry. And then we looked at examples in and out of ag on how to run organizations. And I'll tell you right off the bat, one of the most impressive organizations I saw was the Royal Canadian Legion. That's a phenomenal organization that operates with a modest budget, but does a lot of good across the country. So that was one of the groups that I think I took inspiration from when trying to figure out how we would organize leadership in an economical way. Can we go to the next slide? Placing shearers at the center of the wool conversation. Like I said at the beginning, we looked at shearing through the eyes of all of the different stakeholders. But what made sense to me in the end is that the shearers are really the gatekeepers of the industry. Some people don't like it when I say that. They don't like the word gatekeeper. They don't like that notion, but it's the shearer who goes on farm. It's the shearer who works with the producer. It's the shearer who has a really tough job in a very short period of time. I feel that they should have dominion over their industry. They are the ones removing the wool and getting it into the pipeline. So putting them at the center of the conversation, giving them ownership of the industry and making them the gatekeeper of things like a Canadian wool standard, some declarations on animal welfare, land and water management, those important pieces that the global wool community is starting to make statements about. It made sense that the shearers could be a united organization to hold those claims, those declarations, those promises to the industry. And the shearers also have a great deal of information about wool. They're not just going in and removing the fiber from the animal. They are, in some cases, they're a substitute vet. They can give good information on animal welfare, management of parasites, management of KEDs and other contamination. So it made sense for us to see what the wool industry would look like if they were at the eye of the storm. Next slide, please. So we'll get down to the nuts and bolts of it. and I'll wrap up so that we have lots of time to discuss. But the learning pathways we discovered, first of all, they're not just in shearing, they're also in producer education, and they're in wool handling education. There are lots of producer education modalities in Canada, and lots of good examples around the world. We look to the US, who is a really great example. What we're lacking in Canada is a wool component to a producer education program, a real nuts and bolts kind of thing, basic skirting, packing, why it's important to use square totes when you're packing, why it's important to skirt well, knowing what skirting actually means, what you should be removing from your fleeces. A little bit of that triage information would be really helpful for the producers. Also prep for shearing day, keeping your animals off food and water, keeping them dry, having proper handling systems in place. That is going to make the shearer's life a lot easier, which means they're going to be able to do their job more efficiently. So looking at the producer model, that forms part of the plan. Looking at wool handling, that forms part of the plan. But I see wool handling as coming a little bit later. We have to get the producers agreeing on a protocol for preparing their wool clip, and it has to be in harmony with the shearers. So there's some work to be done there. Which modality of education we choose, I don't think is terribly important. It's that we agree from coast to coast what that's going to be. In terms of shearer education, we have a lot of different opportunities to implement curriculum from other countries. The SEAL program that is used by most countries is very interesting. That's a blue, bronze, silver, and gold SEAL level of accreditation, and it goes by the number of sheep you can shear in a safe and effective way. We also have great trainers that are coming to Canada to teach shearing courses. All of our shearers working in Canada do a fantastic job. What's important, though, is that on the West Coast as well as the East Coast, we're sharing the same curriculum. This is important for everybody right down to the supply chain, how the wool arrives to a processor, how it's packed. If we have shearing that's happening, shearing education that's happening consistently across the country, we're already coming together for a more organized industry. In addition to shearing courses, we identified that competitions and the opportunity to travel and do apprenticeships abroad were the most valuable learning tools. We can agree we don't have a lot of sheep in Canada. We have under 1 million, and that kind of limits the volume of sheep a new shearer can shear without pulling business away from the people who make their living off of it. So our plan looked at ways to fund travel for shearers who wanted to perhaps go to Australia, New Zealand, the UK, South Africa, or elsewhere. And competitions. Right now, Canada has a Holstein Expo competition that's very well regarded. There was also the Stampede competition, which was North America's most prestigious or most high-pursed competition. Both are very well organized and very well respected. Our plan would like to see competitions happening at regional levels to get the young shearers practicing against their colleagues. I've learned that shearing competitions are the best way to measure yourself against others and to learn from others and learn from the masters that are in the competition levels higher than the beginners. So for shearing, just to summarize, we looked at different education modalities, we looked at competitions, and we looked at exchange. I use the word exchange, but we're not necessarily looking to bring people from other countries here to shear, but creating opportunities for apprenticeships for our shearers to go abroad. Those are the 3 areas that we could help our shearers become the best shearers they can possibly be. So those were the learning pathways. Then we looked at our producer education, and we looked at some wool handling training curriculum that could be implemented in Canada. All of that was bundled under an organization, which would be something like a Canadian Shearing Council, not unlike the American Shearing Council, not unlike British Wool or organizations in other countries. So that's how we bundled it. It was just a matter of taking all the pieces of the puzzle, laying them out on the table and arranging them in a way that had flow, where we could look at costs, revenues, things like that. What would it take to run that sort of model? The details are in the Shearing Plan. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I would encourage you to do that. And if you have questions, we'll address them in our question and answer period. Alyssa, could we go to the next slide, please? Next steps. So what do we do with this information? We had our shearers only town hall last week. Tough crowd. It wasn't an easy town hall to have, because this is a controversial topic. It's a passionate topic. In general, I think everyone agrees that there were no criticisms toward the plan. I think the plan was well received. It might need tweaks to properly represent our shearing industry. We have left the plan with our advisors and with the Shearing Canada Facebook page to discuss what makes sense for them. I think if we saw any opposition in our shearers town hall, it was mostly around a misunderstanding of the role that Canadian Wool Council can play in the Shearing Plan. We make it very clear that this plan was for shearers by shearers, and Campaign for Wool, Canadian Wool Council would like to be involved in the future of the Canadian shearing industry. We're there to help. We're there to help access funds if this is something that the shearers need help with. But right now, their next responsibility is looking at the plan and seeing what parts of it are going to make sense to implement right away, and what parts might be a down the road thing, a 5-year from now, a 10-year from now, that kind of thing. The important thing for a harmonized shearing industry is that if the shearers don't take ownership of their industry and create a council that's going to benefit the shearers and their work, somebody else will come in and do it for them. When I first started the Shearing Plan, there was not a lot of talk about shearing. And in the last 6 months, everywhere I look, I hear about shearing. Even on CBC yesterday, there was a story on Matt Galloway's show, The Current, about an author who learned to shear sheep during the pandemic. The planet is calling on us, the wool industry, the natural fiber industry. We need to be stepping up, because we need to have more natural fiber, replacing synthetics, replacing petrochemical fibers. And to do that, somebody is going to come in and take ownership of that if we don't make sure that we're protecting our own industry first. So that was the spirit with which we came to write the Shearing Plan. And I still believe that having consistency from one end of the country to the other is what's going to secure the supply chain, is going to make sure we're all working to the same standards, and that we all have opportunity. That was something that surprised me too. I'll just say this as an aside, and then we can go to our questions. We're going to have the next generation of shearers coming into the marketplace, and they are going to be young people who came through an education system that looks vastly different from the one that we might have gone through, from the one that our parents and grandparents have gone through. And if I kind of have one little prediction, I think it's that future shearing education is going to have to follow the way young people have learned. So it's going to mean more online tutorials, more access to electronic, to software, to business support. It's going to have to step up the game, because our young people are smart and they're adept with technology. They're adept with sharing information. And they're motivated. So that would be something that I would encourage shearers to think about, is how did the next generation learn? What are their values? And to try and build that into what a curriculum might look like and what a national shearing body might look like, what those values might be. So with that, thank you for taking the time to join us. And let's open it up to discussion. There's no questions that are off the table. You're welcome to ask anything. And I'll answer as openly as I can. And maybe we can stop the screen share, Alyssa, so we can see people.
So,
Sorry, Alyssa, just before you begin, thank you, Jane, for
Oh.
beautiful presentation and for all your very hard work on this. I think people see, a nice glossy final report, and it can be deceptive about how much work goes into producing something like that, and the many, many, many discussions, compromises, and stakeholder input that takes. So I just want to thank you again on behalf of the industry for all of that hard work. I neglected to mention earlier, slightly down the hierarchy in terms of what makes this all possible, but nevertheless very important, is of course our funders. The campaign, despite having sharing our patron with the head of state of the country, we do not get any special funding from the royal family or even from the government of Canada. The money that we get is specifically grant funding for very specific projects. So the work that we do and the money that makes these kind of projects possible is all through fundraising and through grant writing and that sort of thing. So all of our funding partners include Alberta Lamb, Briggs and Little, the government of Canada, as I mentioned, Ontario Sheep, Holt Renfrew, and Sykes and Ainley, which is our trading arm. But in particular, this research especially, I want to thank the Douglas Family Foundation and the Ontario Water Centre, because it's their contribution specifically that makes these more challenging topics possible for us to explore. So with that, I would like to open it up to the group, and we'll take questions for Jane.
So you can put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will address them. And I'll read them out. There is one in the chat right now from Megan. It said, what about in-person apprenticeships, a network to connect people with physical experience? Sure, online theory is good, but people need to learn to experience the trade for themselves.
You're absolutely right. There's nothing like hands-on learning. It's critical, and that's what's challenging about the wool industry is we're a big country, and how do you access these people? How do you access these online learning opportunities? So this was a conversation that came up a lot. Lisa and Alex can attest to that. They were both on our advisory boards. How do we offer these courses across Canada where people can get to them? It's not everybody can set aside a week's worth of work and a flight or a road trip to go 3 or 4 provinces over to learn from an expert. So we did do a lot of discussion on this, especially with one shearing wool expert, Michael Pora. Michael's been teaching in Canada for a number of years now. He's taught in almost every country in the world. Absolutely brilliant shearer and also wool handler. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Michael is the only person in the world who is at the top level of wool classing and wool shearing in Australia. So this is he's an Olympic athlete. When I had meetings with him, which were so informative, we sort of looked at, what if we offered shearing courses and wool handling courses across Canada at a beginner level with people who are more than competent, that already exist in Canada or the US, and then once a year have one advanced level course that would rotate to different regions of Canada each year. but it would give people early access in their region and then have something to work towards next year or the year after to go to a central spot in Canada and learn at a more elite level. So yeah, to answer your question, Megan, it is hands-on learning is important. And that's one of the things with Canada is it's big and not everybody can step away from work or step away from the farm to learn. So our vision was to try and bring training as close as we could to the people. I got a few questions on social media that I thought were quite pertinent. So can we talk about wool bags, please? It's always a big discussion. I don't know how many of you on here are producers or if you're coming from more of a hand spinner background, but wool bags are critical for wool. Right now, some producers are using jute bags. They're called sausage bags. They're 7 feet long. They hold about 250 pounds of wool, and they're quite often manually packed. They're easy to access. They're relatively inexpensive, but they make it really difficult for transportation. And I think if we want to see the price of wool go up, a whole host of things need to happen for that, for us to achieve a better wool price that will motivate producers. One of the things is lowering the cost to get wool where it needs to go. If you are packing wool in a square tote, and if you're using a press pack, you can fit more wool in a shipping container or in a truck. It just makes sense. You can fit more bricks in a truck than you can rubber balls. And a lot of people tend to think it's not necessary. We don't do anything with our wool. It costs, you know, the same story. It costs more to shear the sheep than we get for the wool. You'd get more for the wool if it was properly skirted and packed and reasonable, like in a reasonable format for it to get moved into the value chain. And what we'll see more and more is our value chain putting those demands on producers. So I am, you know, doing my own little advocacy for using the square totes, getting easy access to them in Canada. If it takes getting subsidies for producers and shearers to afford square totes, fine. But that is a critical first step. And the press is very important. When you start sending your wool to bigger like transformation centers, like we did this fall, sending wool to England to scour as a test, they have forklifts that remove wool. They don't want these big sausage bags rolling off of a truck. They want their mechanism to fit the way our wool is packed. And I think we'll see that more and more as the wool industry ramps up.
Tara is asking if those square bags are made of synthetic or natural fibers.
I'll say something on that and then I'll throw to Lisa. Her hand's already up. You're good, Lisa. One of the things that the jute bags, I've been told, is they allow contamination to pass through. So the dust outside, if there's rain, there's wet, they do not protect the wool in any way. But this is really Lisa's area of expertise. So would you speak to that, Lisa?
Sure. Thanks, Jane. And this is a good conversation to have. Because we continue to have it even in my location, which is kind of what I would consider a wool center of the US. I still get a large proportion of my wool that comes to the warehouse in burlap. The danger of burlap is that it, as Jane suggested, it allows a little bit more contamination to reach it, particularly if it's not packed tightly. And I'm even referring to moth damage and moisture damage. If it's not put up and stored correctly. And I saw in the chat box that there was a question about whether or not square bags or square packs, what kind of fiber they're made from. They're made from nylon. And a lot of the square packs that you might have seen out in the country, at least what I've seen in Canada at a number of locations, are actually packs that are made from poly, which are a form of contamination. So the true proper packaging is made from nylon. So the white square packs are nylon. And that is a global standard of packaging. And if properly packed, properly closed, it doesn't mean those bags will shed water, but they are virtually impenetrable from other forms of contamination. And wool can store a relatively long period of time without deterioration, as opposed to burlap. I'll use this as an example, how things have changed even for me in the last little while. 2 years ago, I could ship burlap to Texas to our larger warehouse. Now I have to repackage every bit of wool that comes in burlap because of the changes in not only labor issues with related to COVID, but also cost of trucking, cost of fuel. And so we're trying to be as efficient as possible and getting the most bang for our buck when we send a dry van from, in my case, from North Dakota to San Angelo, Texas. Overland trucking is very expensive. That truckload of wool, which would be 40 to 45,000 pounds of wool, is going to cost me just shy of $4,000. Whereas overseas packaging or overseas transportation is more reasonable. So efficiency of packaging is critical.
Thanks, Lisa. Barbara asked a really interesting question. I have an understanding of how this works, but I can throw the question out. Are the wool bags recycled? And I think that some shearers have a really good system, and either Alex or Lisa, you can speak to that. I don't know if Alex is still with us, but either of you can speak to how you would handle that in your business.
Well, I can quickly say something about used packs. We encourage producers of high quality product to put it in high quality packaging. It's a reputation thing. And when that wool travels outside of the US or Canada for processing, again, the better the outside of the packaging, the more quality that is assumed that's in that packaging. But we do allow for recycled or reused bags, and particularly what I would consider in our lower valued lines of wool. When I receive wool, and when a wool buyer looks at wool in square packaging, they have to do some assessment of it. So they have to cut a small hole in the bag to pull out locks of wool to examine. That's just normal protocol. So as a bag gets recycled, turned inside out, so on and so forth, there gets to be, almost to the point where there's too many holes. And so those bags would then be, reach the end of their life. But we certainly reuse bags in my warehouse all the time. We wouldn't put a very high value clip in a reused packaging, but we certainly would put, off sorts and lower valued wools that wouldn't be as impacted by contamination as some of our high value wools.
Yeah, that was something that came up a lot in our advisory meetings. And, what I learned is for, shearers, they're going to take a pack, leave a pack, I think is how a lot of them work. But you're right, Lisa, it does speak to quality when you're using quality packaging. And it is, I think, one of the most important aspects of bringing up the value of our wool is having it be easy to transport in a clean contaminant reduced way. One of the, and anybody can jump in with questions, so don't be shy. One of the things that somebody had written to me on social media is talking about the producer education, how to prep your sheep for shearing, how to prepare the sheep prior to, not just prior to shearing day, but, you know, from genetics onward, how much work is being done in that area. And there, I wanted to speak a little bit to that, and I'm happy we're recording it because I think the person who asked me these questions couldn't be here today. Her name's Jennifer, if she ends up watching this after the fact. First of all, with the Campaign for Wool Canadian Wool Council, we have a working group that's called the Canadian Wool Standard. We have quite a few interesting people on there, including Lisa, and we're putting together kind of a snapshot of what the Canadian wool looks like. We're making a brief declaration on how our sheep are raised, animal welfare policies that exist in Canada, our land and water management declaration, and a bit of a matrix on what kind of wool we have in Canada. This is a document that will eventually, it will be produced this year and put out for adoption for anybody who wants to, use that as their wool standard or give us feedback to improve our wool standard. That's one piece of the puzzle, I think, that's important, and it's another project, I guess you could say, that Canadian Wool Council has enabled. But we haven't forgotten, though, that the producer education component is critical to the success of the shearing industry too. So that's something that we've been addressing in all sorts of different ways. I don't know where I was going with this. I kind of forgot. Sorry. But anyway, when we talked to the shearers, there was this concerted feedback that we must look at producer education. It's more important than looking at shearer education. And yes, it's important. And yes, we're doing that. And yes, we're looking at wool quality with a wool standard. But an important takeaway is that not everybody in Canada is shearing well. They are shearing to the best of their ability. They are shearing in the way they were taught, which is not wrong, but improvements have been made globally. New techniques have come out globally. And I would like to see all shearers in Canada have access to that type of education, have it be delivered consistently in conjunction with producer education so that the entire industry starts to come up in a cohesive way. I hope that made sense. Tara, you have a question?
Good morning. Thank you so much. I was just wondering, with regards to producer education, if a possible option might be producer mentoring. So if you have a producer who's already doing the right things for wool quality, animal welfare, it just seems an awful lot to lay at the feet of shearers, especially once you add biosecurity and some of these other educational things. So maybe a way to take some of the pressure off the shearers for some of these things might be to set up potential mentoring relationships, producer to producer. If someone's already, if a shearer knows someone's already doing a good job and someone wants to do a good job, then perhaps putting those two people together might make it a bit easier for the shearers.
That's a really interesting point, Tara, and I hadn't thought of that. I know that it's in I hadn't really thought of building that into the plan. Matthew, something to think about. Can you set up a hub for us, please, where people who want to have mentoring can sign up? Have an unstable internet connection.
Yeah,
Am I frozen?
You're cutting up a bit, but I think most of it came through. But yeah, no, that's a great idea. I mean, that's certainly one of the areas of one of the reasons why we were looking at shearing to begin with, because not only is it important to have a high standard in training and accreditation and all of those things, but also the average age of a Canadian shearer is, I think Jay, you told me this before, is that it's getting up there. 60, is it 60 something? 50 something.
No, I'm gonna backpedal on that a little bit. The ones who were the most interactive with the process were mature shearers, I would say 45 years and up. But what we did learn through the Shearing Canada Facebook page, when the question was asked, what's the average age on here? I was surprised that there are a lot of younger shearers that have just been getting into the business. So we're talking people from the ages of 18 to 28, maybe that age range. And they've got great businesses going. I would like to see them have more access if they want it, more access to training and an organization to support their careers, an organization that provides insurance, an organization that provides networking opportunities to bring them together, a little bit of funding, business support, things like that.
Okay.
But anyway, we kind of got sidetracked. I like Tara's idea of creating a partnership, like a connection opportunity between mentors and producers. But how would you determine who would be a good mentor? Would there be criteria for that? Does anybody have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole sort of school of thinking just on that. I know in a previous hat, when we were getting mentors for entrepreneurs as part of the veteran entrepreneurship program we ran with Princess Charities, again, we were working with Futurepreneur, which is one of the biggest entrepreneurship organizations in the country. And again, they had all these criteria for how they select mentors, how they pair mentors. So again, you would have to, there's a lot that would go into selecting it, because again, there's nothing worse in a mentorship program than matching the wrong people together. It's going to happen no matter what, but you want to structure a program that minimizes that and so just having, for example, like an open thing where it's like, oh, I need an apprentice, oh, I need a mentor, that won't work. you need to be able to have a little bit more screening than that. And again, I don't have enough knowledge off the top of my head to get into what that would be, but it would need to be a little more structured and probably interviews on both sides. But it has been done in many other fields. So there's definitely models that can be copied.
Well, it's a great idea. We should be looking into that. Thank you for that, Tara. Alyssa, did you want to go through a few more of the questions while we have some time left?
Yeah, so Megan, she's just going back to the courses. Would that beginner course instill a level of skill similar to shearer's assistant, or would that type of class make a person into a full-fledged, if amateur, shearer?
I'm going up to that question. Well, I think the way other countries have looked at that. So if we look at Britain or if we look at New Zealand, they have a course that's learn to shear a sheep. Even Michael Pora from Australia, the Australian model is a bit like that too. Their first course is learn to shear a sheep, and then the second level would be learn to be a shearer, and that includes the learn to be a shearer includes a little bit more background, a little bit more technique for different breeds. The first level, the learn to shear a sheep, that could be somebody who's just working on their own farm. And if you go by the Australian model, it's a 4-day course. The second course, learn to be a shearer, that's a 4-day course as well. And then there is an advanced course that's 2 days. Now, feedback from producers, they say 4 days is too long to be away from farm if they're just going to learn to shear their own sheep. So they proposed perhaps a shorter intro course. But I think that, a learn to shear a sheep, that would make a great model for a shearing assistant or a shearing tech. In Canada, we don't have a big enough industry right now that a shearer goes out with a wool handler in tow. It's mostly one shearer going in to shear the flock. It's not like big shearing crews like Lisa's familiar with in the US or like you see in New Zealand. But it all depends on the person too, as I read your question, because some people are going to pick it up naturally and some are going to have a little bit more trouble. But the way it was described to me, the 3 stages made a lot of sense. The Learn to Shear a Sheep is really just getting people familiar with maneuvering around the animal, keeping yourself safe, keeping the animal safe. And then the Learn to be a Shearer included a lot of other things that you need to consider if that's going to be your profession. I hope that answered the question. Alyssa, you want to keep going?
There was a question on recycling the wool bag, but that was answered in the chat by Lisa, I believe. And Megan is asking back to the bags. Should mills be encouraged to purchase and resell bags required for their proper processing protocols?
I say yes, but let's ask Lisa, who is more of an expert on that. What do you think about that, Lisa?
Well, that's a tough thing. I mean, most mills are consuming wool and not sending it back out again. So unless they, for instance, had a core group of producers that supply wool to their mill, and saw value in purchasing a press and then being able to send it out to shearing days for their clientele to help them put wool in proper packaging. And again, I'm not saying that burlap is not proper packaging. It is packaging that serves a purpose. However, it has downfalls. And if we want to be able to move wool outside of the US or across Canada efficiently, the square packaging is obviously our gold standard, our way we want to kind of strive for. To give you an idea of what a square press would cost, I think you'd be in the neighborhood of 15 to 20,000, and of course I'm thinking in US dollars, so that would be significantly higher. I've shared plans with a number of people for home manufactured square presses that are available on the internet. They make a very good square press if you can find a machinist to manufacture it for you. But I still think with labor and the cost of materials that you're still going to be looking at $15,000. I do think that there's opportunities for agencies to provide supplemental grants to help, producers or mills or shearing crews be able to access these presses more readily. And again, I kind of envisioned that the shearing plan would be able to help an organization work towards attaining funding for finding more or greater access to either building or bringing over square packs from across the water. And so that's one of the advantages that I saw of the shearing plan to kind of bring us back around again, is that collective, that group, that organization has more power in asking for help with things like this that aid in proper packaging of a high quality product. And so that was one of the advantages of putting together a plan that would help kind of circle up these group, a group of people to get more power in the asking and addressing some of these challenges for the industry as a whole. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's great. Well, there's more negotiating and bargaining power when you're in an organization, for any organization, be it a wool handling organization, a producer organization, safety in numbers. Right.
We have a question from Catherine here. Wool handling and producer courses I can see really appealing also to the hand spinning market, even for fiber artisans as raw wool buyers who aren't producers. Could this be a possible bigger driver for revenue in the plan, which should further bolster funding, training, etc. for the shearers? Hope this question makes sense.
Totally, it totally does, and that's a great point. I think that there are so many people who are intrigued and want to learn more about wool handling, about the producer side of preparing wool, and about shearing. We can't underestimate that enough. A shearing organization, I think, is in a perfect position to start introducing all these types of courses, programming across the country. Again, the drum that I beat is to just make it consistent across Canada. Let's have everybody speaking the same, maybe that's two. I was gonna say speaking the same language, but speaking the same wool language, using the same methodologies. And yes, it's a great revenue stream that shouldn't be ignored. Thank you.
We'll put out a last call for questions in the chat. Raise your hand. Going.
But
Great.
Megan, you do make a good point too, that a lot of fiber artists I have found are really they're the wool experts along with the shearers. They're the ones who teach us the most. And some of you are on here today. Helen, I have lots of conversations with Helen about these things. Wool judging, fleece judging at competitions is also a lost art in Canada that we need to be investing in. And I don't see why a shearing organizing body can't undertake that as well, with proper structure and time and resources in place. A real, conservative budget, but also an optimistic one. I think that there's a lot of potential.
That's great. And I'm assuming that wasn't actually a typo, and that also people, fiber enthusiasts are also arsonists. So that's exciting as well. It's a good thing that wool is fire resistant. Just ending on some levity here, everyone. So I want to thank again for Jane for taking time. Jen. Yeah, see, now I'm making typos in my mind. That's my punishment for trying to cast such wicked aspersions. But I want to thank Jane for taking the time to speak with us. For Lisa as a member of the Shearing Advisory Council for joining as well, and for all the others. Did you say Alex as well? And those who've joined us. And of course, our regular gang of wool enthusiasts who join us every month. So we are looking forward to next month. Are we ready? Are able to announce that, Alyssa?
We will shortly.
Okay, I always hope to be able to give you, but we're a heads up. But we will have another exciting speaker for you. Who knows? It might even be Jane again. So again, thank you to everyone for participating. Thank you to Jane. The Shearing Plan is up on campaignforwool.ca. Take a look, read through it. Let us know your thoughts. And thank you again for your support. Again, we build this industry one stitch at a time. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.